On August 15, 1982, a man was drifting down the Green River in Kent, Washington, enjoying what should have been a peaceful afternoon on the water. The sun was warm, the current was gentle, and for a moment, everything seemed right with the world. Then he saw her, a body pale and lifeless, tangled in the reeds near the riverbank. Her name was Wendy Caulfield. She was 16 years old, and she was only the beginning. I need you to understand something before we go any further. What I'm about to tell you isn't just a story about a serial killer. It's a story about how evil can hide in plain sight. It's about the faces we trust, the neighbors we wave to, the ordinary men who kiss their wives goodbye every morning before heading off to work. It's about the question that haunts every community touched by darkness. How could we not have known? If you think you know this story, I promise you, you don't. Not really, not the way I'm going to tell it. And if you're watching this, if you're already here, then you need to share this with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe now, because what follows will change the way you look at the world. It will change the way you look at the people around you. And maybe, just maybe, it will help you understand how monsters walk among us undetected for decades. The Green River winds through King County, Washington, a ribbon of dark water, cutting through industrial parks and suburban neighborhoods. In the early 1980s, it was a place where families picnicked on summer weekends, where fishermen cast their lines hoping for salmon. But beneath its calm surface, the Green River was becoming a graveyard. Within the next month after Wendy Caulfield's discovery, 4 more bodies surfaced from those murky waters. Deborah Bonner, Marcia Chapman, Opal Mills, and Cynthia Hines. All young women, all strangled, all disposed of like they meant nothing to anyone. The newspapers called it the Green River Killings, and the name stuck like a curse on the community. Detective Dave Reichert was one of the first officers on the scene when they found Wendy. He was young then, ambitious, hungry to make a difference. He stood on that riverbank and made a silent promise to himself and to that dead girl. He would find whoever did this. He would bring them to justice. He had no way of knowing that this promise would consume the next 2 decades of his life. The task force formed quickly. 45 detectives at its peak, the largest investigation in American history at that time. They gathered evidence, conducted interviews, followed leads that went nowhere and everywhere all at once. The tips poured in by the thousands. Neighbors suspected neighbors. Wives suspected husbands. The entire county lived under a cloud of paranoia and fear. But the killer wasn't afraid, not even a little bit. While the police scrambled to identify their first victims, he was already hunting for more. The killing ground extended beyond the river now. Bodies appeared in ravines and wooded areas along desolate stretches of highway. He was evolving, learning, adapting to the investigation that was trying desperately to catch him. The victims shared a common vulnerability. Many were young women working the streets along the Pacific Highway South, a stretch of road known locally as the Strip. They were runaways. They were struggling. They were trying to survive in a world that had already failed them in countless ways, and someone was using that vulnerability against them. What strikes me most about those early days isn't the horror of the crimes themselves, though that horror is undeniable. It's the way the world responded to the victims. Because they were sex workers, because they were marginalized, because they existed on the fringes of respectable society, their deaths didn't generate the same outrage that might have come if the victims had been different. college students, cheerleaders, daughters of prominent families. This isn't an accusation, it's an observation. And it's an observation that the killer himself understood intimately. He chose his victims precisely because he knew society would care less about them. He weaponized our prejudices. He turned our blind spots into hunting grounds. By the end of 1982, the body count had reached double digits, and the killer was just getting started. I keep coming back to the river itself when I think about this case. Water has always been a symbol of purification, of washing away sins, of baptism and renewal. But the Green River became something else entirely. It became a dumping ground, a confession of contempt. The killer wasn't hiding his victims in the water because he felt guilty. He was hiding them there because he thought they belonged there. Discarded, forgotten, less than human. The detectives working the case began to develop a profile. The killer was likely white, likely in his 30s, likely someone who knew the area intimately. He probably had a criminal record, possibly for assault or solicitation. He was organized, methodical, patient. He returned to the dump sites, sometimes moving bodies, sometimes leaving trinkets or evidence that suggested he was watching the investigation with interest. But profiles are just educated guesses. They narrow the field from millions of suspects to thousands. And in King County in 1982, there were plenty of men who fit the description. The needle was still buried deep in the haystack. What the detectives didn't know yet, what they couldn't have known, was that their killer had already been interviewed. He had sat across from law enforcement officers, answered their questions calmly, and walked out the door a free man. His name was in their files. His face had been photographed. And they had let him go. His name was Gary Leon Ridgway, and he would continue killing for another 19 years. Gary Ridgway was born on February 18, 1949, in Salt Lake City, Utah. From the outside, his childhood looked unremarkable. A working-class family, a father who drove trucks, a mother who ruled the household with an iron fist, 3 sons who played in the yard and went to school, and did all the things that ordinary boys did in post-war America. But the inside of that household was something else entirely. Mary Rita Ridgway was a complicated woman, a domineering presence who seemed to take particular pleasure in humiliating her middle son. Gary was a chronic bedwetter, a condition that persisted well into his teenage years. Rather than handle this with compassion or medical intervention, his mother chose public shame. She would parade him in front of his brothers, mock his weakness, wash his genitals in a manner that confused and disturbed the young boy. I'm not telling you this to generate sympathy for Gary Ridgway. The man murdered at least 49 women, and likely many more. There is no excuse, no justification, no childhood trauma that makes those deaths acceptable or understandable. But I am telling you this because understanding how monsters are made helps us recognize them before they fully transform. Gary developed complicated feelings toward his mother. Love and hatred intertwined until he couldn't tell them apart. He fantasized about killing her, about watching the life drain from her eyes. These fantasies both excited and terrified him. And somehow, through some dark alchemy of the human mind, those feelings began to transfer onto other women. Women who reminded him of his mother. Women who were sexually available. Women he could control in ways he never could control the woman who had humiliated him throughout his childhood. He wasn't obviously broken. That's the terrifying part. Gary Ridgway graduated from Tyee High School, in 1969. His grades were poor, his intelligence below average, his social skills adequate but unremarkable. He was the kind of kid who faded into the background, neither popular nor unpopular, neither brilliant nor stupid, just there, existing, unremarkable. He joined the Navy during the Vietnam War and served on a supply ship. He contracted gonorrhea from a sex worker overseas, and this experience crystallized something in his mind. A hatred for the women who sold sex, a belief that they were dirty and corrupting and deserving of punishment. The disease became proof, in his twisted logic, that these women were vectors of filth. When he returned to Washington, he got married, then divorced, then married again, then divorced again. His wives described him as controlling, obsessive, about cleanliness, strangely detached from emotional intimacy. But they also described him as functional, as someone who held down a job, who mowed the lawn, who seemed to care about maintaining appearances. He worked at the Kenworth truck plant in Renton painting trucks, day after day, year after year. He was reliable, he showed up on time. He did his work without complaint. His co-workers thought he was a little odd, a little too quiet, a little too interested in talking about religion and sex in the same breath. But they never suspected. How could they? Here's something I want you to sit with for a moment. Gary Ridgway wasn't a genius. His IQ tested at around 82, borderline intellectual functioning. He wasn't charismatic. He wasn't charming in the way we imagine serial killers to be, all smooth talk and hypnotic appeal. He was dull, ordinary, forgettable. And that was his superpower. We expect evil to announce itself. We expect red flags and warning signs and something in the eyes that tells us this person is different, dangerous, wrong. But Gary Ridgway had none of that. He was the guy next door, the guy at the supermarket, the guy pumping gas at the station down the street. He was invisible in his ordinariness, and that invisibility protected him for decades. He began picking up sex workers along the Pacific Highway South sometime in the early 1980s. At first, maybe he was just a customer, but something shifted inside him. The fantasies that had haunted him since childhood began demanding action. And once he killed for the first time, once he felt the power of holding another person's life in his hands, he couldn't stop. The killing became routine. He would cruise the strip in his truck, looking for vulnerable women. He would offer money, offer kindness, offer a ride. He was patient and non-threatening, and the women who climbed into his vehicle had no reason to suspect that these would be their final moments. He killed them mostly by strangulation, his hands around their throats, watching their eyes as the light faded. Sometimes he used ligatures, sometimes his bare hands. The method didn't matter as much as the result. Total control, total power, total domination over another human being. And then he disposed of them like garbage. His dump sites were carefully chosen, remote enough to avoid immediate detection, familiar enough that he could return easily, and return he did. Sometimes to check on decomposition, sometimes to engage in acts with the bodies that I won't describe here. He violated them in death as he had violated them in life, treating them as objects to be used and discarded at his pleasure. The police interviewed him twice during the 1980s, once in 1983, when his truck was spotted in an area known for prostitution, once in 1984, when he failed a polygraph test after being connected to one of the victims. Both times they let him go. The evidence wasn't strong enough. The case wasn't solid enough. And Gary Ridgway went back to his normal life, his job at the truck plant, his third wife Judith, who loved him without knowing what he really was. He attended church with Judith. He went door to door spreading religious pamphlets. He spoke about salvation and redemption and the love of Jesus Christ. And then he went out hunting for his next victim. The duality is almost impossible to comprehend. How do you reconcile the man who prays on Sunday with the man who kills on Tuesday? How do you understand a mind that can compartmentalize so completely, that can separate the public self from the private monster with such surgical precision? I don't have an answer. I'm not sure anyone does. But I know this. Gary Ridgway wasn't unique. There are others like him out there right now, living their ordinary lives, hiding their extraordinary darkness behind smiles and handshakes and the mundane routines of everyday existence. And that should terrify you. The Green River Task Force was drowning in information. By 1984, they had collected over 18,000 pieces of evidence, conducted over 20,000 interviews, and generated enough paperwork to fill an entire warehouse. The investigation was the most extensive in American history, and it was going nowhere. Detective Dave Reichert refused to give up. He had made a promise on that riverbank, standing over Wendy Caulfield's body, and he intended to keep it. But the killer was like a smoke, appearing and disappearing at will, leaving traces that led everywhere and nowhere at once. The bodies kept coming. Marie Malvar, age 18. Carol Ann Christensen, age 21. Martina Otherly, age 18. Cheryl Wims, age 18. They were daughters and sisters and friends, and one by one they vanished from the streets, only to appear weeks or months later in some remote location, reduced to bones and scattered evidence. The task force brought in criminal profilers from the FBI. They employed new forensic techniques that were cutting edge for the time. They organized massive searches, with volunteers combing through forests and fields looking for remains. They did everything right, followed every protocol, exhausted every lead. But the killer stayed ahead of them. I want you to think about something for a moment. This is the part where I need you to pause and really consider what I'm asking. If you discovered that someone you loved, someone you trusted completely, was capable of unspeakable evil, what would you do? Would you turn them in? Would you protect them? Would you even believe the evidence of your own eyes? Leave a comment below. Tell me what you think. Because this question isn't theoretical. It happened to people in this story, and their answers shaped the outcome in ways no one could have predicted. The frustration among the detectives was palpable. They knew the killer was local, knew he was likely someone they had already interviewed. But King County had a population of over 1 million people, and the pool of potential suspects remained impossibly large. Gary Ridgway was on their radar. His name appeared in the files, flagged after those early interviews, connected to known victims through circumstances that were suspicious, but not conclusive. But he was just one name among thousands, one thread in a vast and tangled web. And he was still killing. The gaps between murders varied, sometimes weeks, sometimes months. Ridgway later claimed that he lost count, that the number of victims was so high that they blurred together in his memory. He wasn't bragging. He was simply stating a fact. The killing had become so routine, so integrated into his daily life, that individual victims ceased to exist as distinct human beings in his mind. He had developed techniques to avoid detection. He removed jewelry and identification from the victims, making it harder to identify them. He varied his dump sites, never using the same location too many times. He sometimes placed rocks inside the bodies to weigh them down in water. He was learning from the investigation, adapting to the methods the police were using to track him. The task force scaled back in 1990. Budget constraints, political pressure, and the simple exhaustion of years of fruitless investigation took their toll. The 45 detectives were reduced to a skeleton crew. The media moved on to other stories. The public's attention drifted elsewhere. But the families of the victims never forgot. They formed support groups, held memorials, kept the pressure on law enforcement to continue the investigation. They refused to let their daughters and sisters disappear into obscurity. And Dave Reichert never stopped. He had been promoted, had moved on to other assignments, but the Green River case remained his obsession. He collected files at home, worked the case on his own time, waited for the break that he knew somehow would eventually come. The 1990s were a strange limbo. The killings seemed to have stopped, or at least slowed dramatically. Ridgway later admitted that he had continued killing during this period, but had become more cautious, more selective, more efficient at avoiding detection. The bodies from this era may never be found. He was living his ordinary life, working at Kenworth, attending church with Judith, going to swap meets on weekends. He had photographs of himself during this period, smiling at the camera, looking for all the world like a contented middle-aged man with nothing to hide. But the evidence remained. Hidden in storage somewhere was a small piece of biological material, a sample taken from one of the victims in 1987, preserved against the day when technology might catch up with the killer's crimes. That day was coming, and Gary Ridgway had no idea. The year was 2001. 19 years had passed since Wendy Caulfield's body was pulled from the Green River. The task force had been reduced to a single detective, Tom Jensen, who worked the case part-time while handling other assignments. The investigation had become a cold case in everything but name. But forensic science had undergone a revolution. DNA analysis had evolved from a promising theory to a powerful tool. New techniques called STR analysis could extract genetic profiles from samples that would have been useless just a few years earlier. Evidence that had sat in storage for decades could now speak with a precision that previous generations of detectives could only dream about. Detective Jensen began reviewing old evidence, looking for anything that might be suitable for DNA testing. He found what he was looking for: preserved samples from several victims, maintained through the years by detectives who believed that science would eventually provide the answers they couldn't. One sample came from Marcia Chapman, victim number 3, another from Opal Mills, victim number 4, a third from Carol Ann Christensen, victim number 16. The samples were sent to the state crime lab, and the waiting began. Simultaneously, investigators decided to revisit the suspect list from the 1980s. Gary Ridgway's name was still there, flagged but never eliminated. In 2001, undercover officers followed him to his workplace, waited for him to finish his lunch, and retrieved the styrofoam container he had thrown in the garbage. They sent it to the lab, and they waited. I want you to understand what this moment meant for the families who had been waiting for answers for 2 decades. Some of them had given up hope. Some of them had died without ever knowing what happened to their daughters. Some of them had been forced to build lives around an absence. around a question that could never be answered. The call came on November 30th, 2001. The DNA from Gary Ridgway's saliva matched the samples recovered from 3 separate victims. After 19 years, they finally had their killer. The arrest was almost anticlimactic. Officers found Ridgway leaving his shift at the Kenworth plant, the same job he had held for over 30 years. He didn't run. He didn't resist. He simply looked at the officers with an expression of mild surprise, as if he had known this day would come eventually and was almost relieved that the waiting was over. His wife Judith had no idea. She had lived with him for 17 years, shared his bed, eaten his cooking, accompanied him to church every Sunday. When reporters asked how she felt about her husband's arrest, she could barely form words. The betrayal was too complete, too devastating to process. The interrogation that followed was unlike anything the detectives had experienced. Gary Ridgway didn't deny his crimes. He didn't demand a lawyer. He didn't exercise his right to remain silent. Instead, he began talking, and once he started, he couldn't stop. He described the murders with a detachment that chilled even the experienced investigators. He discussed methods of strangulation, locations of dump sites, techniques for evading detection. He spoke about his victims not as human beings, but as problems to be solved, obstacles to be overcome on his path to satisfaction. And the number kept rising. 48 victims. Then 49. Then more, possibly many more, that he couldn't remember clearly. He had killed so many that they had become abstract, a blur of faces and bodies that merged together in his memory. The detectives faced a terrible choice. They could prosecute Ridgway for the crimes they could prove and accept that many victims would never be identified or recovered. Or they could make a deal. They made a deal. In exchange for providing detailed information about the location of remains and the identity of victims, Gary Ridgway would be spared the death penalty. He would spend the rest of his life in prison, but he would not be executed. It was a compromise that satisfied no one completely, but served the greater goal of providing answers to families who had waited too long already. The confession took 6 months. Ridgway led investigators to remains scattered across King County, pointed out locations on maps, provided details that only the killer could have known. Some families finally received the closure they had sought for decades. Others would never find their daughter's remains, despite Ridgway's attempts to remember where he had left them. He confessed to 49 murders, making him the most prolific serial killer in American history at that time. But investigators believe the true number is much higher, possibly over 70. The victims who were never found, the women whose disappearances were never connected to the case, the bodies that have decomposed beyond any hope of identification. They will never have their names known. They will never have their stories told. But they existed, they mattered, and they deserved better than the fate that found them on the Pacific Highway South. I need to tell you about the women. Not as victims, not as statistics, but as human beings who lived and loved and dreamed before their lives were stolen by a monster. Wendy Caulfield was the first to be found, but she wasn't the first to be taken. She was 16 years old, a runaway with a troubled history, a girl who had slipped through every safety net society had constructed. She loved music, according to those who remembered her. She had a laugh that could fill a room. She trusted the wrong person at the wrong time. Deborah Bonner was 25, a mother who had made hard choices in a hard life. She was trying to get clean, trying to build something better for herself and her child. She had been clean for 3 months when she disappeared. Her daughter was raised by relatives and spent years wondering why her mother never came home. Opal Mills was 16 with dark hair and bright eyes and a future that would never unfold. She liked to draw, she had plans. She believed that things would get better, that the streets were temporary, that someday she would have a house and a job and a life that didn't hurt so much. I could continue. 49 names, 49 stories, 49 lives cut short by hands that never should have touched them. But numbers don't convey the weight of what was lost. Statistics don't capture the way a mother's heart breaks when she realizes her daughter is never coming home. The families of the victims became a community unto themselves, bound together by shared grief and shared determination. They pushed for legislation to improve protections for vulnerable populations. They advocated for better resources for missing persons investigations. They refused to let their daughters be forgotten. Some of them forgave Gary Ridgway. This fact still amazes me, still challenges everything I think I understand about human nature. They stood in that courtroom, looked at the man who had killed their daughters, and chose to release the hatred that was consuming them. Robert Rule was one of them. His 16-year-old daughter, Linda, had been Ridgway's victim in 1982. For over 20 years, he had carried the weight of her loss, the burden of not knowing what had happened to her. When Ridgway finally confessed, when Linda's remains were finally recovered, something shifted in Robert's heart. He wrote to Ridgway in prison, not to curse him, not to demand explanations, but to offer forgiveness. He said he did it for himself, to free himself from the prison of hatred that had contained him for too long. He said Linda would have wanted him to find peace. I don't know if I could have done the same. I don't know if forgiveness on that scale is something I'm capable of. But I respect the courage it takes to choose healing over hatred, to look at the face of evil and decide that it will not define the rest of your life. Other families chose differently. They attended every parole hearing, ensured that Ridgway would never see freedom again, kept the pressure on a justice system that sometimes seemed to forget about victims once the perpetrators were behind bars. Both choices are valid. Both are expressions of love for the women who were lost. There is no right way to grieve, no correct response to unimaginable loss. There is only the path each person finds through the darkness. The victims themselves, if they could speak, might ask only that we remember they were more than their deaths. They were more than the worst thing that happened to them. They had favorites, colors, and songs they loved, and people who loved them back. They had value that transcended the circumstances of their lives and their deaths. Society failed these women long before Gary Ridgway found them. They fell into vulnerability because systems that should have caught them didn't. They ended up on the Pacific Highway South because somewhere along the line, every other option had been closed to them. This isn't an excuse for anything, it's an explanation. And it's a challenge. Because if we want to prevent the next Green River killer from claiming the next generation of victims, we need to address the conditions that make certain populations so vulnerable in the first place. The predator will always exist. Human nature, in its darkest expressions, is not something we can legislate or educate away. but we can make it harder for predators to find prey. We can value every human life equally, regardless of circumstances. We can refuse to create hierarchies of victimhood that allow killers like Ridgway to operate with impunity because their targets are not considered important enough to protect. That would be a legacy worthy of the women who died along the Green River, a world that refuses to forget them, refuses to repeat the failures that cost them their lives. The courtroom was packed on December 18, 2003. Families of victims, media representatives, law enforcement officials, and curious observers filled every available seat. Gary Ridgway sat at the defense table wearing a red jumpsuit and an expression that revealed nothing. The sentencing hearing lasted 2 days. Victim impact statements poured forth, waves of grief and rage that washed over the courtroom like a tide. Mothers who had lost daughters, sisters who had lost sisters, friends who had lost women they loved and would never stop loving. Some spoke through tears, some spoke through clenched teeth. Some could barely speak at all, their statements read by advocates or family members. The cumulative weight of their words was almost unbearable, a catalog of loss that seemed to stretch beyond the capacity of any courtroom to contain. Ridgway himself was given the opportunity to speak. His statement lasted 11 minutes, a performance that divided observers. Was it genuine remorse? Was it calculated manipulation? Was it the confused mumblings of a damaged mind trying to process what it had done? He apologized. He said he was sorry for the grief he had caused. He cried, though whether the tears were real or performed remained a subject of debate. He asked for forgiveness, though he had no right to expect it and many families had no intention of granting it. Judge Richard Jones imposed the sentence, 48 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 10 years for tampering with evidence. Ridgway would die in prison. He would never again see the streets he had hunted, never again feel the sun on his face as a free man. The sentence was both a victory and a compromise. Many families had wanted the death penalty, wanted Ridgway to experience the terror and helplessness that he had inflicted on their daughters. But the deal had been made, the trade of information for life. The detectives who made that bargain defended it until the end, arguing that the certainty of finding remains outweighed the symbolic value of execution. I understand both perspectives. Justice is a complicated concept, and different people define it differently. For some, justice meant watching Ridgway receive a lethal injection. For others, justice meant finally knowing where their daughters' bodies lay. Both views are valid. Both are rooted in love and loss. Dave Reichert, the detective who had made that promise on the riverbank 21 years earlier, was there for the sentencing. He had kept his word. The killer was caught, convicted, sentenced. The nightmare was finally over. But was it? Can any legal proceeding truly provide closure for loss on this scale? Can any sentence undo the damage, heal the wounds, restore what was taken? The families scattered after the trial. Some remained connected, bound by shared experience. Others drifted apart, each finding their own path forward through the aftermath of tragedy. The Green River Killer became a chapter in true crime history, a case study taught in criminal justice courses, a subject for books and documentaries and podcast episodes. But for the people who lived it, who lost loved ones, who spent years waiting for answers that came too late, it was never just a story. It was their life, It was the hole at the center of their family. It was the birthday candles that went unlit, the graduations that were never attended, the grandchildren who would never be born. Gary Ridgway was transferred to the Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla, where he would spend the remainder of his natural life. He adapted to prison routine quickly, perhaps unsurprisingly, given his demonstrated capacity for compartmentalization. He became a model prisoner, causing no trouble, attracting no attention. He continued to provide information to investigators periodically, leading to the recovery of additional remains. Whether this cooperation was motivated by genuine remorse or simply a desire for any form of interaction with the outside world remains unclear. Perhaps both, perhaps neither. The inner workings of Gary Ridgway's mind remained largely opaque, even after years of interviews and psychological evaluations. The Green River Task Force was formally disbanded after the sentencing. The files were archived. The evidence was stored. The detectives who had devoted years of their lives to the case moved on to other assignments, carrying the weight of what they had witnessed into their future work. But the case changed them all, every one of them. They had stared into the abyss, and the abyss had stared back. Some found ways to cope. Others struggled. The psychological toll of working serial murder cases is well documented, and the Green River investigation was more extensive and more grueling than most. They had done their job. They had caught the monster. And now they had to find a way to live with everything they had learned about human nature in the process. Gary Ridgway is still alive as I speak these words. He is an old man now in his 70s, confined to a cell where he will die. The world has moved on around him. Technologies have advanced. Presidencies have changed. New generations have been born who know the Green River Killer only as a character in documentary films and true crime podcasts. But for some people, the clock stopped in the 1980s. They remain frozen in the moment when they last saw their daughter or sister or friend trapped in an eternal present of loss that time cannot diminish. This case changed everything about how serial murder investigations are conducted. The mistakes made by the Green River Task Force became lessons for future law enforcement. The DNA technology that finally caught Ridgway was refined and expanded, becoming a standard tool in criminal investigations. The victim advocacy movement that emerged from the family's suffering grew into a national force for change. In that sense, the women who died along the Green River did not die in vain. Their deaths, as senseless and cruel as they were, contributed to systems that have protected countless others. Cold cases from decades past have been solved using techniques developed in the pursuit of Gary Ridgway. Families who thought they would never have answers have received them because of lessons learned in King County, Washington. It's not enough. It will never be enough, but it's something. Dave Reichert went on to become sheriff of King County, then a United States congressman. He wrote a book about the case, kept the memories of the victims alive, continued to advocate for missing persons investigations and victim rights. The promise he made on that riverbank became a lifetime commitment. The Green River itself still flows through Kent, Washington. It looks much the same as it did in 1982, a ribbon of dark water cutting through a landscape that has changed dramatically around it. The industrial parks have expanded. The suburbs have grown. The Pacific Highway South has been cleaned up, though the problems that created the hunting ground have migrated elsewhere rather than been solved. People still fish in the Green River. Families still picnic along its banks. Time has softened the horror, transformed it from immediate threat to historical fact. Most of the people who live there now weren't born when the killings occurred. They know the river's dark history only as a story, something that happened to other people in another time. But the river remembers. Or at least, we should remember on its behalf. The women whose bodies sank into its murky waters deserve to be remembered. Not as victims, not as cautionary tales, but as human beings whose lives were stolen by a monster who walked among us undetected for far too long. I've spent a long time thinking about what this case means, what lessons we should take from it, and I keep coming back to the same conclusion. Evil is ordinary. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't wear a sign. It looks like the neighbor next door, the co-worker down the hall, the stranger at the gas station. We want to believe we would recognize it. We want to believe that our instincts would protect us, that something in our gut would sound an alarm. But Gary Ridgway proved that ordinary people are invisible, that the unremarkable can be the most dangerous, precisely because we pay no attention to it. What do we do with that knowledge? I don't have a perfect answer, but I think it starts with paying attention. Noticing the people around us, taking seriously the concerns of vulnerable populations, building communities where predators have fewer opportunities to find prey. It starts with remembering the women who died, remembering the failures that allowed their deaths, remembering that every human life has value, regardless of circumstances, regardless of choices, regardless of the judgments that society passes on those who exist at its margins. The Green River Killer case is closed, but the work it demands of us is not. The work of creating a world where women can walk safely through the night, where vulnerability is not a death sentence, where the Gary Ridgways of the future find no hunting grounds. That work belongs to all of us. And it continues. I promised you at the beginning of this story that there would be victory. That seems like a strange promise to make about a case involving 49 confirmed murders and possibly many more. What victory could there possibly be in such overwhelming tragedy? But there is victory, and it's important that we recognize it, that we don't let the darkness overwhelm everything else. The victory belongs first to the families who survived. They buried their dead. They mourned their losses. And then they got up every morning and kept living. They raised children. They built careers. They found ways to carry their grief without letting it destroy them. Mary Rule, mother of victim Linda Rule, became an advocate for victims' rights. She transformed her devastation into purpose, spending years pushing for changes in how missing persons cases are handled. She didn't let her daughter's death be meaningless. She made it mean something. The family of victim Tracy Winston started a scholarship fund in her name, helping young women from difficult circumstances access educational opportunities that Tracy never had. Every year they award money to students who remind them of Tracy, who have her spirit, her determination, her refusal to give up even when the odds are stacked against them. These are small victories, perhaps, but they are real. They are proof that love can outlast loss, that purpose can emerge from tragedy, that the human spirit is capable of transformation even in the face of unimaginable pain. The victory belongs also to the detectives who never gave up. Dave Reichert kept his promise. He caught the killer. He gave the families answers. He proved that dedication and persistence can triumph even when the odds seem hopeless. Tom Jensen, the detective who finally cracked the case with DNA evidence, demonstrated that scientific progress can provide justice even decades after the crime. His patience and precision proved that killers cannot escape forever, that evidence has a way of speaking truth even when years have passed. The task force officers who spent years on a case that seemed unsolvable, who sacrificed time with their own families to find closure for others, who carried the weight of those murdered women's stories everywhere they went. They are heroes, even if their heroism involved no single dramatic moment, but rather thousands of hours of grinding, exhausting, seemingly fruitless work. The victory belongs to science itself. The DNA technology that caught Gary Ridgway has since solved countless other cases. Cold cases from decades past have been cracked open. Families who thought they would die without answers have received them. The innovation that emerged from the Green River investigation has rippled outward, touching lives that will never know the name of Wendy Caulfield or Marcia Chapman or any of the other women whose deaths pushed forensic science forward. The victory belongs to every person who has worked to make the world safer for vulnerable populations. The advocates and social workers and counselors who try to catch people before they fall into circumstances that make them prey. The organizations that provide resources for sex workers, for runaways, for anyone who exists at the margins where predators hunt. They are fighting the same battle that the Green River Task Force fought, just on a different front. And they are trying to eliminate the conditions that create hunting grounds, to value every human life equally, to refuse the hierarchies that made Gary Ridgway's victims invisible until it was too late. And the ultimate victory? Gary Ridgway will die in prison. He will never again feel sunlight on his skin as a free man. He will never again cruise the Pacific Highway south looking for his next victim. He will spend his remaining years in a cell, stripped of the power that he craved, reduced to just another aging inmate shuffling through the routines of incarceration. He thought he was more powerful than the women he killed. He thought he could take and take and take without consequence. He thought the world would never catch up with him. He was wrong. The system worked. Slowly, imperfectly, painfully, but it worked. The monster was caught. The monster was punished. The monster was stopped. I began this story by telling you about a body in the river, a moment when the long nightmare of the Green River killer began. Let me end it by telling you about all the women who are alive today because that nightmare ended. They walk the streets that Gary Ridgway used to hunt. They exist in the spaces he would have stalked. They live and love and dream because he is locked behind bars, because detectives refuse to give up, because DNA technology caught up with a killer who thought he was too clever to be caught. We don't know their names. We never will. They are the murders that didn't happen, the victims who never became victims, the lives that continued because one man's reign of terror finally ended. That is the victory. Unseen, unquantifiable, but real. Every day that passes without another body in the Green River, every woman who walks safely home, every family that remains whole, that is the victory. The dead cannot be brought back. The years cannot be restored. The grief cannot be undone. But the future can be protected, and it has been. Remember Wendy Caulfield. Remember Deborah Bonner. Remember Opal Mills and Marcia Chapman and Carol Ann Christensen. Remember all 49 of them, and remember the unknown others whose names we may never learn. But remember also that their story doesn't end with their deaths. It ends with justice served, with lessons learned, with a world made slightly safer by their sacrifice. It ends with families who found closure, detectives who kept their promises, and a killer who will die behind bars. It ends with victory. If this story has moved you, if it has changed how you see the world, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. And carry the names of these women with you, a reminder that every life matters, that every person has value, that even the most invisible among us deserve to be seen, protected, and remembered. This is the story of Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer. This is the story of the women he murdered and the people who loved them. This is the story of the hunt that lasted 20 years and the justice that finally arrived. And this is the story of victory, hard-won and bittersweet, rising from the ashes of unspeakable tragedy. The river still flows, but it no longer holds secrets. And that, perhaps, is victory enough.